My mother was never a woman who asked for much. She learned early how to reduce her needs, how to occupy as little space as possible, how to move through the world without drawing attention, not because she believed she deserved less, but because life had taught her that demanding too much often came with consequences she could not afford. Still, she carried herself with a quiet dignity, the kind that doesn't sparkle, doesn't impress, doesn't seek approval, the kind that lives in clean hands, in a steady gaze, in the way someone shows up even when no one is watching. That morning began like so many others. She woke up before the sun, moved softly through the house, made coffee strong enough to keep her awake, but gentle enough not to waste it. She chose her clothes carefully. Nothing fancy, nothing careless, clean, simple, respectable. She tied her hair back the way she always did when she needed to be taken seriously. That detail mattered to her. She didn't say why she was going out. She rarely did. She believed that explaining herself invited judgment. She simply said she would be back soon. I watched her leave with a feeling I couldn't name yet. The place she went to wasn't extraordinary. It was one of those spaces that exist everywhere. An office, a counter, a waiting area, where people sit holding papers that represent their lives reduced to numbers. Places where power hides behind procedures and rules are applied selectively. She waited, standing at first, then sitting. When told, then standing again because someone decided she should not sit there. Time stretched. Minutes became heavier than they should have been. When she was finally called, she walked forward calmly. She spoke politely. She explained what she needed. It wasn't a request. It was a right. Something she was entitled to. But entitlement is a fragile thing when it comes wrapped in the wrong accent, the wrong clothes, the wrong skin, the wrong bank account. The first remark came disguised as clarification. Are you sure you understand what this means? Her voice stayed calm as she answered yes. Then came the correction. No, that's not how it works. Didn't anyone explain this to you? She tried again. She clarified. She pointed to the document she had brought. Carefully folded, carefully protected. The response hardened. This is very basic information. It's written right there. Her fingers tightened around the paper. She felt the shift before it fully happened. The moment when the conversation stopped being about information and started being about hierarchy. Someone else joined in. A glance was exchanged. A breath of impatience. If you can't read properly, you should bring someone who can. The words were spoken quietly, calmly, professionally. That was the cruelty of it. No raised voices, no insults that could be reported, just enough disdain to make her feel small, and not enough evidence to prove it. She felt heat rise to her face. Not shame, not guilt, injustice. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong. But knowledge does not always protect you when power decides otherwise. She attempted one last explanation. Her voice wavered slightly, not because she doubted herself, but because she understood the risk of continuing. She was interrupted. I already explained this. You're not understanding, because you don't want to. Then came the laughter, short, content, shared between people who felt safe in their superiority. Others nearby heard. Some pretended not to notice. Some glanced over briefly and looked away. No one intervened. No one asked if she was okay. Humiliation rarely needs an audience that reacts. Silence is enough. She stood there for a second longer than necessary, holding her purse close to her body as if it anchored her to herself. Then the final sentence was delivered, smooth and definitive. You can leave now. You're disturbing the process. That was the moment something inside her cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically. Something quiet gave way. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She gathered her papers slowly, stood up and walked toward the exit with her head held high, not out of pride, but because lowering it would have meant accepting a guilt that was never hers. Outside, the world was unchanged. Cars passed. People laughed. Life continued at its usual pace. The contrast was violent. She walked home with measured steps. When she opened the door, she didn't speak. She placed her purse down, washed her hands, and went about her routine as if nothing had happened. She cooked, she cleaned, she folded clothes. Only her eyes betrayed her. Red, tired, distant. When I asked if everything was okay, she said one word. Nothing. That word carried everything she refused to say. That night she cried quietly, careful not to be heard. And somewhere between the sound of her breathing and the walls that held it in, something else was born, a memory that would not fade, a wound that would not disappear, a promise that would not stay silent. After that day, the house did not change. The furniture stayed where it was. The walls held their familiar marks. The routine continued its careful choreography. Morning coffee, afternoon chores, evening television murmuring in the background. But something invisible had settled into the space. Silence gained weight. My mother did not speak about what happened. Not once. She did not describe the place, the words, the faces. She didn't even allude to it indirectly. It was as if naming the event would give it power, or worse, make it real in a way she could not control. Yet the silence spoke constantly. It showed itself in how she moved more cautiously, as if the world had suddenly become narrower, in how she hesitated before asking questions, even in places where she had every right to, in how her shoulders stiffened when someone used a sharp tone, no matter how trivial the context. Humiliation doesn't disappear when the moment ends. It migrates. It settles into the body, into reflexes, into expectations. She still woke up early, but now she lay awake longer before getting out of bed. I noticed her staring at the ceiling in the dark, her eyes open, her breathing shallow. Sometimes she would sigh softly, not in sadness exactly, but in exhaustion, as if bracing herself for another invisible impact. She stopped telling stories. Before, she would talk about small things, a neighbor's comment, a memory from her childhood, a thought she had while walking home. Those stories were never dramatic, but they were hers. After that day, her words became purely functional. Dinner is ready. Don't forget your keys. It's going to rain. The personal disappeared. The world had taught her something cruel, that expressing herself invited scrutiny, and scrutiny often turned into judgment. One afternoon, I found her reorganizing documents she had already organized many times before. She was meticulous, almost obsessive, papers aligned perfectly, folders labeled with careful handwriting. She wasn't organizing, she was preparing, as if the next encounter with authority might require proof, not just of her case but of her worth. I wanted to tell her she didn't need to do that she was enough as she was, that the problem was never her. But I stayed quiet, because I understood something important. Reassurance offered too easily can feel like dismissal, as if the pain were simple, fixable, temporary. It wasn't. The silence wasn't empty. It was dense, charged. It carried everything she hadn't been allowed to say. At times I caught her rereading the same document, the one she had taken with her that day. She didn't annotate it, didn't change it, just held it, studied it, as if searching for the invisible flaw that had justified the way she was treated. That was the most violent aftermath. Humiliation plants doubt where certainty once lived. It forces people to interrogate themselves endlessly, even when they know logically that they were not wrong. One evening she noticed me watching her. "You don't have to worry," she said gently. That gentleness cut deeper than anger ever could. Because it wasn't meant to comfort me. It was meant to minimize herself. Another lesson learned too well: don't make others uncomfortable with your pain. Days passed. Then life resumed its rhythm. But her relationship with the world had shifted. She spoke less to strangers, smiled less reflexively. She chose invisibility whenever possible, not because she wanted to disappear, but because disappearing felt safer. And inside me something began to change. At first it was anger. Hot, unfocused, useless. I imagined confrontations, speeches, justice delivered in dramatic moments. But anger alone has no direction. It burns, then consumes itself. What replaced it was sharper awareness. I started noticing how often voices like hers were interrupted, how often patience ran out faster when someone spoke carefully, instead of confidently, how rules bent easily for some, and hardened instantly for others. I realized that what happened to my mother was not an exception. It was a pattern, and patterns survive because people adapt to them, because silence becomes strategy, because endurance is mistaken for acceptance. One afternoon I asked her if she wanted to go back. She didn't answer right away. When she finally did, her voice was low, controlled. "I don't know if I can afford to." That sentence stayed with me, not emotionally, structurally, because it revealed the truth beneath the silence, that justice often demands resources, time, energy, emotional safety, that some people simply don't have. The system counts on that. It counts on exhaustion, on fear, on people choosing survival over confrontation. And yet beneath her caution, something else was growing. Not rage, not defiance, resolve. It appeared in small moments, in how she corrected a cashier politely, but firmly, in how she insisted on finishing her sentence when interrupted, in how she no longer laughed nervously to smooth over discomfort. These were not acts of rebellion. They were acts of reclamation. The silence was still there, but it was no longer empty. It was gathering weight, and weight, when it shifts, can move things. The decision didn't arrive all at once. It formed slowly, the way bones mend, quietly, invisibly, until one day you realize something that was fragile can now bear weight again. My mother didn't announce it. She didn't frame it as courage or justice or closure. One morning, while pouring coffee into a chipped mug, she simply said, "I need to go back." There was no drama in her voice, no tremor, just certainty. I felt my body tense before my mind caught up. That place still lived in me, as threat, as insult, as unfinished harm. Why? I asked, though I already knew the answer wouldn't be simple. She took a moment, looked out the window, watched the street wake up. "Because I don't want that day to be the last memory I have of myself there." That sentence held more strength than any speech. She wasn't going back to confront anyone, not to accuse, not to demand apologies. She was going back to rewrite something internal, something that had been left suspended. On the day she returned, she dressed much like before. Clean clothes, hair tied back, same purse. But the difference was subtle and unmistakable. She wasn't armored. She was present. The walk there felt longer this time, even though the distance hadn't changed. I could see it in her steps, measured, grounded, deliberate. Fear was still there. It always, but it no longer dictated her movement. Inside, the same fluorescent lights, the same counters, the same neutral walls pretending to be objective. But she was not the same person who had walked in before. She waited again, sat when told, stood when called. The ritual repeated itself, but its meaning had shifted. When she spoke, her voice was calm and steady, not defensive, not apologetic, clear. She stated what she needed. She referenced the document. She explained. Once, when interrupted, she didn't rush. She didn't retreat. "I wasn't finished," she said. The words landed without force, yet they carried weight. Something unexpected happened. They listened, not immediately, not generously, but enough. The laughter never came. The glances stayed neutral. The tone remained professional, not kind, but contained. And sometimes containment is enough to change the outcome. She was asked questions. She answered them. She wasn't rushed out. She wasn't dismissed. She was treated as a person whose presence belonged in that space. When she left, the sky looked the same as it always did. No cinematic light, no symbolic rain. But her body knew the difference. That evening she didn't collapse into silence. She spoke, not about every detail, but enough. "They didn't apologize," she said. "I didn't need them to." She slept deeply that night. The kind of sleep that comes after something long held finally loosens its grip. And I understood something crucial. Justice doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes it looks like standing where you once shrank, and not shrinking this time. My mother didn't defeat a system. She didn't change policies or dismantle structures.
But she reclaimed narrative. She refused to let the moment of her humiliation define the space forever. That refusal mattered. It changed how she carried herself afterward. She no longer avoided places that reminded her of that day. She entered them with caution. Yes, but not with submission. And it changed me. I stopped fantasizing about dramatic confrontations. I stopped mistaking loudness for power. I saw what real resistance looked like. It was controlled. It was quiet. It was persistent. It was a woman refusing to disappear. The world did not become fair overnight. It rarely does. But it became less absolute, less capable of convincing us that it could not be challenged. And that shift, small as it may seem, created space. Space for memory without paralysis. Space for anger without destruction. Space for dignity to return and settle back into its rightful place. We didn't celebrate that day. We didn't mark it with words. But something fundamental had turned. The scene had been revisited. The script had been altered. And what comes after a turning point is not resolution. It is consequence. After she returned, life did not become lighter. That is one of the quiet truths no one likes to admit. Healing does not erase weight. It redistributes it. My mother did not suddenly trust the world again. She did not become optimistic or naive. If anything, she became more precise in how she moved through things that carried authority. She listened more carefully. She chose her words with intention. She paid attention to tone, posture, timing, not out of fear, out of clarity. What she carried forward from that day was not pain in its raw form, but awareness sharpened by experience. She knew now exactly how thin the line was between being respected and being dismissed, and how often that line had nothing to do with merit. That knowledge changed how she interacted with others like her. I noticed it when she spoke to women in waiting rooms, in lines, in shared spaces where nothing official bonded them, except patience and fatigue. She listened more closely. She offered information quietly, not as instruction, but as solidarity. They'll ask you for this, she would say softly. Don't let them rush you. You have the right to sit. Small sentences, heavy impact. She never framed herself as a victim. That word never passed her lips. She didn't want pity. She didn't want sympathy. What she wanted, what she claimed, was legitimacy. The right to exist in spaces without having to justify her presence. At home, the silence loosened further. It didn't disappear, but it became less like a wall and more like breathing room. She spoke about other things again. Memories resurfaced. Opinions returned. Her laughter came back slowly, carefully, as if testing whether it was still safe to let joy be audible. And I changed too. I became more observant, less willing to accept explanations that hid power behind politeness. I started noticing how often people like my mother were spoken over, corrected prematurely, or subtly positioned as burdens rather than participants. I noticed how exhaustion was mistaken for incompetence, how politeness was mistaken for ignorance, how silence was mistaken for consent. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you carry it, you can't put it down. The event itself, the humiliation, began to recede in detail. Faces blurred. Words lost their exact edges. But the lesson remained intact, carved deeper than memory. Dignity is not granted. It is defended. Sometimes loudly, often quietly. I watched my mother refuse small erasures. She corrected people when they mispronounced her name. She asked follow-up questions when something wasn't clear. She no longer apologized reflexively for taking time. These acts would look insignificant to anyone searching for drama, but they were revolutionary in their consistency. The world did not reward her for them. It rarely rewards this kind of resistance, but it responded. Subtly, unevenly, imperfectly. Still, response matters. What she carried forward was not an expectation of fairness. It was a refusal to internalize unfairness as personal failure. That distinction reshaped everything. I realized that humiliation's greatest victory is not the moment itself, but what it convinces you to become afterward. Smaller, quieter, less demanding of space. My mother rejected that ending. She did not become hardened. She did not become bitter. She became grounded, and grounding is powerful. It roots you so deeply in yourself that the world's attempts to shake you lose efficiency. Years later, I would see that grounding reflected in how I spoke, how I listened, how I stood my ground without theatrics. I carried her experience not as inherited pain, but as inherited vigilance. A vigilance that asks, who is being diminished here? Who is being rushed, ignored, made to feel foolish? And why? Some legacies are loud. Others are precise. This one was precise. It lived in posture, in tone, in the refusal to laugh along with cruelty, in the instinct to pause when someone else was being reduced to less than they were. What my mother carried forward was not a scar she showed. It was a line she would not cross again, and by holding that line, she taught me how to hold mine. Some stories don't end. They settle. What happened to my mother never asked for closure in the way people expect it. No apology letter. No formal acknowledgement. No symbolic victory that could be framed and hung on a wall. Instead, it folded itself into her life, becoming part of the quiet structure that held everything else up. Time passed, and the details softened. The faces involved lost their sharpness. The exact phrasing of the words blurred. Even the building itself became just another place among many. But the core of the experience remained intact, preserved not as pain, but as orientation. It pointed her in a direction. She no longer waited for permission to exist fully in spaces that once intimidated her. She didn't announce herself, but she didn't erase herself either. She occupied exactly as much room as she needed, and not an inch less. That balance was deliberate. I saw it in the way she spoke to doctors, to clerks, to anyone whose authority once would have made her retreat into politeness, at her own expense. She was still respectful, still composed, but she was not small. That distinction mattered. She never told the story as a lesson, never turned it into advice or warning. She didn't gather people around it, or use it to define herself. In fact, most people who knew her well never heard it at all. Yet it lived on. It lived in how she taught me to listen for what wasn't being said, in how she showed me that dignity is often defended in ordinary moments, not dramatic ones, in how she demonstrated that survival with integrity is a form of authorship, because that's what she ultimately did. She rewrote the ending, not by changing the past, but by refusing to let the past speak last. Humiliation wants permanence. It wants to echo. It wants to convince you that it revealed something true about you. My mother denied it. That satisfaction. She carried the experience without letting it calcify. She allowed it to sharpen her awareness, not dull her compassion. She did not confuse caution with cowardice, nor silence with weakness. And that restraint, that discipline, became the final word. Not theirs, her. As for me, I carry it forward differently. I tell the story, not to expose her, not to seek outrage, but to interrupt the pattern that depends on forgetting. Because humiliation thrives in isolation. It survives when it's hidden. It repeats when it's unnamed. This is not a story about victory. It is a story about refusal. The refusal to disappear. The refusal to internalize contempt. The refusal to let someone else decide your worth. That refusal does not make noise. It does not demand attention. But it endures, and in the end, endurance is its own kind of justice. That is the last word.